Okay, hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about something called rites of passage. And as I put here, these rites of passage include birth ceremonies, raising of children, and then what happens to adults. And we'll look at the death rites as well. And what I want you to pay attention to is where you have parallels to modern day. And I think you'll see quite a few parallels. Now, this very first slide is kind of a depressing slide. It talks about something called exposure. And that's what happens when children are not wanted for various reasons and they are exposed to the elements. And so I'll just talk a little bit about that. It talks, this is from Aristotle, his work on politics, and it talks about things not only like exposure, but also abortion. And so why don't you stop the slide, stop the video, and go ahead and read through the slide. And of course, I just want to point out that, we have these ways of talking about the ancient world that seem very kind of sterile and non-emotional. But you know that exposure of children, taking a child away from its mother or its family, was not something taken lightly. And so we have a couple of sources from the ancient world, ancient Greece in particular, that talk about the effects of this. And these two quotes are from a playwright called Euripides in his play called The Suppliant Women. And again, why don't you go ahead and stop the slide and then read through what these women probably went through when their children were taken away for exposure. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the differences between Athens and Sparta. And that's because sometimes you find things are very different between the two. And so in the following slides, I will sometimes put what happens in Athens and what happens in Sparta. And I just talked about exposure. So in Athens, the city-state of Athens, it would be the father that would decide what's going to happen to the child. And in Sparta, it would be really the government who would decide whether a child is going to live or die or be exposed. I had mentioned this before when I talked a little bit about the history of Sparta, that when a male child is born and it's deemed to be healthy and the state will allow it to live, then the baby is assigned some land and some helots, which are slaves. Um, in Athens, you have something called a naming ceremony, and this is called amphidromia. And I really like how words are put together, so I've given you the Greek here. Amphi means around, to go around something, and dromao just means to run, or to run a course. And what you do is, or what happened in this naming ceremony, is that the baby was born, and then they waited 5 to 7 days to give it a name. And then the family carries it around the hearth. Now, the hearth is sort of the center of the family in the house, and this is the around part in the amphidromo. And then you would let people know whether it was a boy or a girl. So you'd put olive branches on your door for boys, and then you'd put wool outside for girls so that your neighbors would know whether it's a boy or girl. If you had a wealthier family, and sometimes it didn't mean a lot of wealth, you might have a nurse, or maybe it's a servant that would help with the raising of children. And then here you've got a vase that survived. It's dated from between 440 and 430 BC, showing a male baby being handed off to a nurse. And this is fairly common. We've got lots of other really interesting images from vases on early childhood. And I thought this one was interesting because you can see the baby in a high chair, which is kind of similar to what we have today. And then you've got this image, which is a statue of an older man. You can see his beard, giving something to the child, and you can see sort of the hand of the child coming up to grab whatever that is. In terms of upbringing of children, so what you find is that, usually both in Sparta and in Athens, there's a difference between what happens to a male child and what happens to a female child. So in Athens, a mother or nurse will bring up the children, at least the boys, to age of 7, and later for girls. Now, the boys would go to school. If the family had money, there was no such thing as public schools back then. So if your family had money, they would send you to school. Girls would stay home. They would learn sort of what sometimes commonly called domestic arts like weaving and keeping up the house and the economy, running the economy of the house. And then girls would get married usually around the age of 15. If you've been keeping up with the textbook, you know that a lot of times girls were sort of engaged to somebody when they were very little. In Sparta, it's very different than what happens in Athens. So education was state sponsored, and it was really a military education. So if you remember, I talked about how Sparta had taken over Messenia in particular, captured those people and made them slaves or helots. And so with the population rising of the helots, you didn't have such a high population for the Spartans, and this really made them a military structure. And so you find this in how they raise their kids. So the boys are taken from home at 7, and then they're raised in military barracks. And things are pretty harsh for these kids. They're barefoot, they sleep on mats, they're encouraged to steal, but they cannot get caught. If they get caught, they get a lot of punishment. Girls, we know, do exercise. And unfortunately, we don't know too much about their education because I had mentioned that the Spartans really didn't write a lot of their own things down. So we don't know too much about that. Maybe there was singing and dancing, and that's done mostly through archaeology. We do know in Sparta that girls had physical exercises that they had to do. And you can read this quote from Plutarch. The reason that they were involved in sports is that so they could make strong children. And again, think back to the military culture. You needed a lot of healthy boys in particular to go off to fight. Okay, and then we come to sort of the teenage years. In Athens, you have something called the Festival Apaturia. And what this is the city-state of Athens will register these young men into groups. And fratria is a word for brotherhood. So this is where the word frat, the fraternities, come from. It's a brotherhood of young men. And so this is where they are brought into their tribe or their deme. And we know a little bit about the process of what happens to these boys. And I've given the list here. So you've got a banquet on the first day. There's sacrifices to Athena or Apollo, haircut. And then they're assigned to a deme, which is a tribe. And then they spend 2 years in the military doing military training. Now, a deme, this is where we get the word democracy from. So a group of people or the tribe. Spartans, again, very different for the boys. This is really military training. So I've given you some of the ages here, 14 to 19, they're doing survival training. And then almost to be up to the age of 30, they're doing military training. And they're still living in these boot camps. They're taken away from their families at the age of 7 and then have a very tough military life. Now, this kind of training is not suited for everybody. And so Xenophon talks about what happens to a young male who cannot handle this type of training. It really hurt the entire family. So go ahead and stop the slide and you can read through this particular section to read about what happens to men who couldn't handle this training. Okay, and then let's come up to marriage. So this is a very famous frieze showing the marriage of the two top gods, God and Goddess, Hera and Zeus. And we know a little bit about the process of what's happening during this. So these marriages are arranged, and I mentioned this before, and our textbook goes into this in some detail. Sometimes the bride is guaranteed to somebody when she's a young girl. And then the bride's father organizes the ceremony and includes a dowry, which is usually property or some type of wealth. Now, again, think about what's happening in our modern day society where you've got, it's traditional, doesn't always happen, but traditional that the bride's family pays for the wedding. And so this goes back quite a ways. And then what you see after this is sort of her passage from being a girl to a woman. So one day before her marriage ceremony, they take her toys and they destroy them. On the day of the ceremony, she gets a haircut, she's veiled for part of the ceremony, and then unveiled for some of it, and then they have a banquet feast. And then what happens is that the woman and her husband would either move into his parents' house, or if he had his own house, she would move in with them. But the father of the bride would take the daughter in this procession. And I'll show you an image of a procession here in just a second. So this is an image again from a vase showing a bride getting ready and sort of her bridesmaids helping her. And then here's an image again from a vase showing a bride and groom after they've been married. And notice the little sort of cherubs surrounding her and sort of preparing her veil. Here's an image of a wedding procession. So remember I mentioned that the bride's father and mother will take their daughter to her new household. And then what she does is she brings her own goods and sometimes her own dowry. And we know, at least in Athens in particular, that her dowry must be saved. So if they have a divorce, she gets her dowry back. Anyway, so what she does is she goes into her new house and she also walks around the hearth and she makes offerings to the household gods. And in Sparta, things are very different. So men tended to get married and women tended to get married between the ages of 20 and 30. But I just mentioned that Spartan men lived in barracks until the age of 29. So they could not live with their wife until the age of 30. And Plutarch gives us this really interesting account of what happens with the marriage custom. So the bride would shave her hair, dress like a man, the room would be dark, and then her bridegroom would slip in, and then they would do their thing, and then it would be quite a while before he even actually got to see his wife in the daylight. Now again, this is according to Plutarch, but very interesting, very different ceremony from what happens in Athens. I do have a couple slides here on war. I'm not really going to talk about that because war will play a big part in a lot of Greek history. But here you've got a soldier with his dog, probably saying goodbye to his father and his mother. And you can see his mother. Let me see if I can get this highlighter to work. She has a bull here, and what she's going to do is make a sacrifice to the gods for the protection of her son. And here you can see this sort of same idea here. This is a husband with his wife behind him and his parents in front. Okay, and then let's move on to some of the rituals surrounding death. You have something called the laying out of the body, which is called prothesis. Women were in charge of all of this, so they had to clean the body and prepare it for the ekphora, which is the carrying out, which is the actual funeral ceremony. So, and then, they do the same thing that we do today. If the body is left whole and not cremated, then they will put it in the grave. There'll be libations, which is sacrifices. So you just saw that image of, someone with a jar, so they would pour wine and things, and sometimes leave little offerings in the gravesite. And then they would have something called the 3-day rites. And then sort of what is done today, there'd be a funeral banquet. And I've given you the Greek name here. And then there's 9-day rites, so rites that happen 9 days after someone passes away. And then the next 3 slides, the last 3 slides I have, are kind of depressing. These are images found in a child's tomb. So you can see a little child playing with a vase and a little toy. Here is a family stele. So a stele is like a gravestone. So usually they're 3 feet tall, 4 inches wide. Again, they look like a modern gravestone. And you can see here a mother, a father, and then the child down below. Now, what's really interesting is in a lot of Greek artwork, children aren't really portrayed as children. They're portrayed as little adults. And this is one example. One example here. Here's another stele showing a child with a pet bird. And then finally, there's a really good book called Coming of Age in Ancient Greece. And here's a stele of a child at the gravesite with her doll and her dog. Anyway, so these are some of the rites of passage that the ancient Greeks went through. And again, I find it really interesting that many of the rites of passage are very similar to what we do today.